Hey guys, tonight we begin with the uncomfortable reality of being a household slave in ancient Athens, a city that built its entire reputation on beauty, wisdom and democracy, and quietly asked someone else to do all the actual work. Then we turn to the remarkable true story of Pasion, a man who arrived in Athens as a slave, spent decades being owned by someone else, and somehow ended his life as one of the wealthiest and most respected citizens in the ancient world, which is either the most inspiring story in Greek history or the most unsettling, depending on how you look at it. After that, we go underground, quite literally, into the silver mines of Laurion, where the real cost of Athenian civilization was extracted from the earth by people who did not get to enjoy any of it. And finally, we take a long look at the institution everyone prefers to skip when teaching about ancient Greece, the fact that Athenian democracy, that gleaming ideal of civic participation and human dignity, was built on a foundation of enslaved human beings and functioned at every level because of them. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here, and let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is. I always like seeing where in the world people are watching from. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let us ease into tonight's journey together. You wake up before the city does. Not because the morning is peaceful, and not because you have any particular affection for early rising. You wake up because there is no version of your day that begins with rest. The household wakes when it wakes, which means you have to be awake before that, and the margin for error is small, and the consequences for missing it are not. Your sleeping space is not a room, it is a corner, a cleared section of floor near the kitchen hearth, close enough to the heat that summer is miserable, and close enough to the cold stone that winter has its own opinions about your spine. There is a thin mat beneath you. It is yours in the way that anything can be yours when you own nothing. You press your hands against it and push yourself upright, and your body files its morning complaints in order, beginning with your lower back, which has been lodged in a formal grievance against this mat for longer than you can remember. The city outside is still dark. Athens in the hours before dawn belongs to the dogs, the fishmongers arriving at the agora before the sun, and people like you, who are already moving, already preparing, already invisible. You do not watch the sunrise as a beautiful thing, you watch it as a deadline. The hearth is your first task. You crouch beside it, coaxing the coals back to life, feeding them carefully, breathing low and steady to keep the smoke from flooding the room before the ventilation does its job. The smell of wood smoke is so familiar you barely register it anymore. It is simply part of what morning is. Your hands know what to do without your full attention, which is good, because your full attention is already moving forward through the day, mapping out everything that has to happen before the household can function, and mapping out your place inside each of those tasks. You know this day the way you know all days here, not with enthusiasm, but with a kind of complete and practical knowledge that belongs only to people who have performed the same work enough times that their body has memorized it separately from their mind. Water comes next. The nearest fountain is 3 streets away, and the kylix, the large clay vessel you carry it in, is heavier than it looks when it is full. You have made this walk more times than any number could reasonably express. Your feet know the uneven stones. Your shoulder has learned to hold the weight at an angle that distributes it slightly more charitably. You go in the half-dark, nodding to the other figures doing the same, other domestic slaves from other households carrying out the same opening choreography of the day. You do not stop to talk. There is not time, and the street is not safe for lingering when the light is still thin. The fountain itself is a small gathering of familiar strangers. You see these people every morning but know very little about them beyond the household they serve, the general direction of their daily movements, and the particular way each of them holds the clay vessel against their hip. There is a woman from the household 2 streets over who always arrives before you, and is always already leaving when you get there, moving with the efficiency of someone who has calculated her day to the last minute. There is an older man you have never heard speak who fills his vessel with a deliberateness that suggests either great care or very tired arms. You fill yours and go. The street is beginning to lighten at the edges. You have maybe an hour before the household expects things to be ready, and an hour in a house that needs feeding and heating is not actually an hour at all. By the time you return, the household is beginning to stir. The master's family will not be hurried. They wake at their own pace, which is the pace of people who have never had to calculate time against consequence. You hear movement above, the shuffle of sandals on stone, the quiet murmur of someone calling for water, which you have already brought, which you are already heating, which will be ready before it is asked for a second time. This is the standard. Not good enough, not impressive, simply expected. Breakfast in a prosperous Athenian household is not elaborate by any measure. Bread, olives, a little cheese if the household is doing well, wine mixed with water because straight wine at dawn is a choice that requires a particular kind of commitment. You prepare it without being asked, because being asked would mean someone had to wait. And waiting is a form of inconvenience that falls on you. You lay it out carefully, neatly, the way you have been shown, the way it is expected to appear, and then you step back into the part of the room where you're not quite present. This is a skill that takes time to develop. The art of being in a room without being in a room. Standing close enough to respond immediately, far enough that you are not intruding on a conversation, visible enough that you're not missed, invisible enough that no one feels observed. You have become quite good at it. You're not sure this is something to be proud of. It simply is. The body learns. That is what bodies do in situations where learning is the difference between a manageable day and a painful one. You have learned to read the room from the corner of it, to detect the small shifts in posture and expression that signal an approaching request before the request is made, to move before you are called, which is the version of yourself that this household finds most satisfactory. The master is a citizen of Athens, a man of moderate wealth, educated, engaged in the life of the city. He has opinions about philosophy and politics, about the right way to organize a household, about the character of his neighbors, about the proper training of his sons. He is not a cruel man, by the standards of the world you inhabit. He does not beat you casually or without cause. He feeds you adequately. He regards you on most days with a kind of comfortable indifference, the way a person regards the furniture they have had for long enough that they no longer really see it. You have heard other slaves talk about their masters at the fountain, in the brief moments when conversation is possible, and you have concluded that indifference, while not pleasant, is significantly better than the alternatives that other people describe. Indifference means you exist in the background of his life, rather than at the center of his frustrations and existing in the background. You have learned is one of the better positions available to you. You understand that this is the better version of the situation. You've heard enough to know that other versions exist. The morning moves into its second phase. The mistress of the household requires assistance with her preparations, and this falls to you, specifically to the domestic slave who's been assigned to her needs, which today is you. You help her with her hair, with the arrangements of her clothing, with the small domestic performances that a woman of her station is expected to make each day. She talks to you sometimes while this happens, not asking questions that require answers, more a running narration of her thoughts, offered to the room in general, of which you are the most convenient receptive surface. She talks about her sister, about a dispute with a neighbour, about the quality of the olive oil delivered last week, about her husband's decision regarding one of the sons. You listen. You make sounds of acknowledgement at the appropriate intervals. You are careful not to offer opinions because opinions require a kind of standing you do not possess. And unsolicited opinions from a slave are a very fast way to create a problem for yourself. She is not unkind. She is simply located somewhere on the spectrum of human sympathy, where you exist as a person-shaped convenience, rather than a fully realized individual with an interior life. You have made a kind of peace with this, not a comfortable peace, a practical one. There are days when her narration touches on things that have their own weight for you, decisions about the household, changes in how things are run, the arrival or departure of other slaves. You receive this information in the same register as everything else, attentive, quiet, making no sign of anything. The skill of making no sign of anything is perhaps the most valuable you have developed here. It protects you in ways that are difficult to explain but easy to feel. The children are next. 2 boys, the elder already preparing for his education, the younger still in the phase of childhood that involves maximum noise and minimum awareness of cause and effect. You help manage the younger one through breakfast, which is a project of quiet endurance, and escort the elder to where his tutor waits, a task that requires navigating 2 streets and approximately 15 negotiations about whether he can stop and look at something along the way. The answer is always no. He always tries anyway. You have concluded that this is simply his personality, and there is no efficient solution to personality. The elder boy is beginning to be aware of your position in a way that is different from how he was aware of it when he was younger, beginning to understand that the person who escorts him to his lessons is not quite the same category of person as his tutor or the neighbour's sons, beginning to absorb the social grammar of Athens that explains where various people fit in various arrangements. You watch him learning this because you watch everything, and you wonder quietly what shape it will take when it finishes forming. Back in the household, the real work of the morning begins in the kitchen. This is where you spend most of your time, and you have complicated feelings about it. The kitchen is hot, smoky, and demanding. It is also, in a way you would not choose to articulate to anyone, yours, in the sense that you know it better than anyone else in the household, know where everything is kept, know which clay pots have hairline cracks that will leak if filled too high, know which fire runs hot and which needs coaxing, know the timing of every dish to within a margin that the household has come to rely on without understanding how it was achieved. You know the kitchen the way you know the route to the fountain and the disposition of the mistress in the morning and the particular complaints of the stone floor when the weather is damp. You know it because knowledge, in the absence of other forms of ownership, becomes the thing you hold. Knowledge is a strange comfort when it belongs to circumstances you did not choose, but it is still something. The midday meal requires preparation that begins well before midday. Lentil soup, bread, olives, whatever the market produced this morning. You did not go to the market. Another slave handles that, a trusted one who has been given the small authority of purchasing decisions, which in this household means a very specific list and very specific prices that are not to be exceeded and very specific consequences if they are. The ingredients arrive, you work with them, you grind, chop, stir, monitor, adjust. The fire does what fires do, which is mostly cooperate and occasionally threaten to get out of control. You manage it. This is what you do. There is a particular rhythm to this kind of work that you have noticed exists regardless of how you feel about the work itself. Your hands move, your body occupies itself. Your mind, somewhat freed from the immediate demands of concentrated thinking, goes somewhere else entirely. Where it goes is not always a place you would choose. Sometimes it goes to the past, to places and people before this, to the chain of events that led to this kitchen in this city with these people. You do not linger there long. The past is not helpful in any practical sense, and you have learned to be relentlessly practical. Sometimes your mind goes to what might be different, not what will be, because speculation about what will be is a luxury you have carefully rationed. But what might be? The small contingent possibilities that exist in the margins of a life like this. A trusted slave who has served a household well for many years can sometimes be granted a degree of autonomy, can sometimes be allowed to hire themselves out, keeping a portion of what they earn, can sometimes accumulate enough to purchase their own freedom. This is not common. It is not guaranteed. It is not anything you would describe as a plan. But it is a fact of the world you inhabit, and facts are things you hold on to. You turn this particular fact over in your mind the way you might turn a coin that you found and are not sure belongs to you, examining it, not spending it, simply knowing it is there. Between tasks there are small windows that belong to no particular duty. A few minutes while the soup simmers, a moment when the upstairs has gone quiet and the next instruction has not yet arrived. You use these windows with a careful economy that you have not taught yourself so much as discovered through accumulated necessity. You eat something, quickly, whatever is available and left over. You sit against the kitchen wall and let your back remember that sitting is different from standing. You breathe in a way that is deliberately slower than the pace the work requires. These are not rest, exactly. They are the brief negotiations you conduct with your body to convince it that the next stretch of work is still within the range of what it can manage. The afternoon brings different demands. The household has guests today, which means additional preparation, additional service, additional presence required in the main room where the guests are received. This is the part of the day you find most exhausting, not physically, though the physical part is real enough, but in the concentrated effort of performing a particular kind of self-effacement for hours at a time, pouring wine without spilling it, replenishing plates before they are empty, anticipating needs before they are expressed, remaining attentive without being intrusive, disappearing into the background while being completely available. All of this has to be performed simultaneously, seamlessly, in a way that makes it look like the household simply runs, like comfort appears without effort, like someone is not standing in the corner calculating every move. The guests talk freely. They discuss the affairs of the city, the assembly, a recent legal case, the performance of a play at the Dionysia. They talk about Athens as though Athens belongs to them, which in the ways that matter, it does. They are citizens. They vote. They serve on juries. They debate philosophy in the agora. They are, by the measure of their world, free men living in a free city. The city's identity is built on this. The democracy, the culture, the philosophy, all of it flows from this idea of the free Athenian citizen. You pour their wine. You do not speak. You're not part of the conversation and never will be, and this is not remarkable to anyone in the room except possibly you. Possibly. You listen to the arguments they make about justice and virtue and the proper way to live, and you do so with the part of your mind that has learned to separate the content of what is being said from the circumstances in which it is being said, because mixing the two would make the kitchen very difficult to navigate without losing your composure entirely. One of the guests is a man who speaks at some length about the nature of freedom, about what it means for a person to be truly free, about the philosophical distinction between those who are free by nature and those who are not, about how the Athenian citizen embodies something genuine and admirable about human potential. He says this with evident conviction. He believes it. You refill his cup. He does not look at you. This is probably for the best. The guests leave as the light begins to change, that particular warm amber shift of an Athenian late afternoon that the poets write about, and you have never quite had the leisure to look at properly. There is clearing to do, dishes to wash, the main room to restore, the evening meal to begin. The day has not finished simply because the guests have. The day finishes when the household no longer requires anything of you, which is usually well after the dark has settled in, and the stars are doing whatever stars do above a city that is sleeping. The evening meal is simpler than the midday one, which is the one mercy the later hours reliably provide. Bread and whatever remains from midday, some dried fish, perhaps some olives kept in a small ceramic vessel, whose lid you replace the same way every time out of a habit so deep you're no longer conscious of it. You prepare, serve, and clear in the familiar sequence, and then you begin the inventory that closes every day. The quiet check of the kitchen supplies, what needs to be replaced, what was used and how much of it, the running internal accounting that allows you to arrive at the market tomorrow with the correct list before anyone has to ask. This, too, is a form of knowledge that belongs to you in the only sense that anything here does. You eat when there is a moment to eat. Whatever remains, whatever has been set aside for you, whatever the kitchen produced beyond the household's needs, it is adequate. It is usually warm, which is something. You sit against the kitchen wall in the particular stillness that arrives when there is finally nothing actively required of you, and you breathe, and you let your body begin the process of disassembling the day. Your hands rest in your lap, palms up, and you look at them for a moment, the way people look at their hands when they're very tired, as if checking that the hands are still there, still functional, still the same hands they were this morning. They are. They're also tired. There are other people in the household who are enslaved, and the relationships among you are neither simple nor fully safe. There is something that might be called solidarity, a recognition of shared circumstance, a willingness to cover for each other in small ways when the work exceeds what one person can manage. But there is also the pressure that any closed system produces, the awareness that information shared within the household can travel in multiple directions, that trust is a resource as limited and as precious as anything else. You are careful with each other, careful in the way that people are careful when the stakes of a mistake are higher than the stakes of the mistake itself. The mat is there when you return to it. The hearth is still faintly warm. The city outside has gone quiet in the way cities go quiet when the population is sleeping, and only the people who have no choice are still awake. You close your eyes. Tomorrow the well is 3 streets away. Tomorrow the bread must be started before the household stirs. Tomorrow the children will be loud and the mistress will need assistance, and the master will have expectations that must be met before they are articulated. You already know all of this. You're already, somewhere beneath consciousness, preparing. Because this is what the system you live inside requires of you. Not just your labour, but your anticipation of labour, your perpetual readiness, your willingness to exist in a state of continuous availability. The system does not ask if this is comfortable. The system does not ask very much at all. It simply continues, and you continue inside it, and the city built on this arrangement calls itself the birthplace of freedom, and is not wrong exactly, just careful about which people it means. You sleep. The mat does its insufficient best. Tomorrow arrives already carrying its demands, and somewhere in the city, the first fishmongers are heading toward the agora, and the fountain is already beginning to see familiar faces, and the long, repetitive, ordinary machinery of a slave's day in ancient Athens is winding up again, exactly as it was, and exactly as it will be, until something changes, which is not the same as saying something will. The way time passes in a domestic slave's day is unlike the way time passes for anyone else in the household. For the family, time has a kind of natural texture, moments of relative ease followed by activity, meals as events with a beginning and an end, evenings that belong to them in a way that evenings in this household do not quite belong to you. For you, time is a series of tasks that flow directly into each other with very little space in between, each one already anticipated before the current one is finished. The day a single continuous thread of requirement that runs from before sunrise to well after the house has gone quiet. You have noticed that exhaustion has its own architecture. There is the tiredness that sits on the surface of you at the end of a morning of heavy work, and then there is the deeper kind that accumulates over weeks and months, the kind that does not clear fully with a night of sleep, and that lives in the bones in a way that is less complaint than simply condition. You carry this second kind the way you carry the water vessel, without always being aware of it, until something makes you aware of it. A moment when you try to move quickly and your body declines to cooperate with the speed you had intended, or a moment in the evenings when you sit against the kitchen wall and realize, with a faint surprise, that you have not sat down since the previous evening. The physical landscape of Athens is beautiful in a way that you register without quite having the leisure to feel. The city rises and falls with the hills beneath it, the Acropolis commanding everything from above, its marble catching the particular quality of Attic light in the mornings and evenings in ways that even the most indifferent observer cannot entirely ignore. You have seen these things. You have moved through the city with the water vessel, and with the children, and on errands that take you briefly into the streets, and the city is there, present, sometimes stunning in the way that it arranges its buildings and its light, and its stone against the sky. You do not have time to look at it the way the citizens do, the way the philosophers strolling in the agora look at it, the way the visitors who have travelled from other polis look at it, with the leisured attention of people who have time to let beauty accumulate into appreciation. You look at it in transit, between tasks, in the brief seconds when you are moving from one requirement to the next, and the city happens to be in the way. You notice it. You do not linger. Lingering is not something your day permits. The social world of the household's enslaved people is its own geography, invisible to the citizens who live inside it and impossible to navigate without understanding. There are hierarchies, not formal ones, not announced ones, but real ones nonetheless, the kind that develop when a group of people who have no formal standing relative to each other are required to interact daily in close quarters with significant shared stakes. The slave who has been with the household the longest carries a kind of authority that is not given but accumulated. The slave who manages the household accounts has access to information that others do not. The slave who has the ear of the mistress in the daily personal interactions of dressing and conversation occupies a position of informal influence that everyone in the household understands and that several people navigate around. You're not at the top of this internal hierarchy and not at the bottom of it. You're somewhere in the middle, which is in many ways the most instructive place to be, close enough to the people with more leverage to observe how they use it, close enough to the people with less to understand what the bottom of the system feels like for those who occupy it. The enslaved people at the bottom of the household hierarchy are those who are newest, those who are most visibly frightened, those who have not yet developed the fluency in the household's particular expectations that allows a person to operate efficiently and therefore somewhat safely. You were there once. You remember what it was to not understand the rhythms, to misjudge a request, to appear at the wrong time in the wrong room with the wrong expression on your face. You learned. This is what people do. The relationship between the enslaved people in the household is complicated by the fact that trust is both necessary and dangerous. You need allies. You need people who will cover for you when the work exceeds what one person can manage, who will tell you when the master is in a particular mood that requires adjustment, who will receive the information you have gathered from your position close to the family and share the information they have gathered from theirs. This informal exchange is valuable and constant and almost entirely invisible to the people it is about. But trust in this environment is a resource with limits. Information that travels in one direction can also travel in another. A person who tells you about the master's mood might also tell the master about yours, not out of cruelty, necessarily, out of calculation, out of the understanding that in a system where you have no formal protections, your most reliable protection is the favourable opinion of the person who owns you. If you like the video so far, please leave us a like and a sub. A sub to the channel helps us make more videos for you to watch and keep the channel alive. And favourable opinion can sometimes be purchased by being useful to the owner in ways that are not entirely comfortable. You're not unfamiliar with this calculation. You have seen it made. You have watched relationships within the household reconfigure when someone made it. So you are careful. You trust within limits that you have calibrated over time through observation and one or two experiences of the limit being in a different place than you had assumed. You are warm enough to function as part of the household's social fabric. You are not so open that you have created vulnerabilities you cannot see. The political life of the city reaches into the household in ways that are not always obvious. The master's civic activities, his participation in the assembly, his service on a jury, his involvement in the political networks that determine which families have access to which opportunities, all of this shapes the household's situation in ways that then shape your situation. When the city is at war, the household economy tightens, the demands on it change, sometimes increase, sometimes change in character. When the political climate is anxious, the master's mood reflects it, and the master's mood is something you live inside as much as he does, more completely in some ways, because you cannot leave the room when you find it uncomfortable. You have opinions about the political situation that you do not share. This is not because you have no standing to hold opinions. Your mind is as capable of forming them as anyone else's in Athens, but because you have no standing to express them, and expressing them would accomplish nothing except drawing attention to yourself in a way that serves no one. So the opinions exist in the interior, turning over quietly as you work, observations about the city and its choices that have the particular quality of thoughts that are never spoken, which is that they become very precise over time, very clear, because there is no friction of conversation to soften them, or redirect them or resolve them into something less sharp. The Athens you know is not the Athens that Athens describes itself as. The Athens you know is the one that operates in the pre-dawn, in the kitchens and the workshops and the spaces that the official image of the city does not tend to feature. It is a city that depends, in the most foundational sense, on the labour of people who are not considered part of it, and that manages this dependency by not looking at it directly, by building its self-description around the parts that are easier to admire, by finding in the philosophy and the architecture and the democracy a sufficient supply of things to celebrate, that the other parts stay out of focus. You know it stays out of focus. You are the thing that is out of focus. There are days when the work in the kitchen produces something that could be called satisfaction, in a quiet, uncelebrated way. A lentil soup that has come together exactly as it should, the proportions right, the timing right, the texture of it carrying the warmth of the herbs you added at the right moment. A loaf of bread that has risen well and browned evenly, and will be genuinely good rather than merely adequate. These things happen sometimes, not always, not even often enough to constitute a pattern you could rely on, but occasionally, in the way that any skilled work occasionally produces an outcome that is better than the sum of its inputs. Nobody tells you when this happens. The household eats without comment, or with the kind of comment that acknowledges the food without particularly noticing it, the way people acknowledge things that are supposed to be good, but you know. You can tell from the way the food looks and smells before it is served. You can tell from the particular texture of the bread when you turn it out, and the crust has the exact quality you were trying for. This private knowledge, the knowledge that the work was done well, is a small thing. It is also one of the only things in your day that belongs entirely to your own assessment, rather than to someone else's standards and expectations. You have been thinking, in the way that people think when their hands are occupied and their minds are partially free, about something one of the guests said this afternoon. The guest was speaking about the soul, about whether the soul of a person is the same regardless of their circumstances, whether the nature of a person's inner life is affected by the conditions they live in. He was speaking abstractly, philosophically, in the manner that educated Athenian men speak about philosophy as an intellectual exercise conducted at a comfortable remove from the situations it describes. He reached no firm conclusion. The conversation moved on to something else. You are standing in the kitchen thinking about his question with considerably less comfort and considerably more precision. The answer, from the inside of the question, is that the soul does what it must, adapts to what is required of it, finds ways to continue that are not always pretty, but are effective. Your interior life is not the interior life you would have constructed in different circumstances. It is shaped by these circumstances, by the requirement for vigilance and the restriction on expression and the daily practice of being present without being visible. Whether that shaping has done something to the fundamental nature of who you are, or whether it has simply given a different shape to something that remains essentially itself, is a question you turn over sometimes, without resolution, in the same way the guest turned over his philosophical question, except that yours is not abstract. The kitchen fire is lower now, banked for the night. The household has gone quiet. In the city outside, the last of the agora activity is wound down. The wine shops that serve later into the evening have their own particular sound when the hour gets late, a kind of cheerful indifference to the passage of time that you can hear on still nights as a murmur somewhere outside the household walls. The streets will not be entirely empty for some time yet. Athens has a nightlife, modest by later standards but real enough, the kind of activity that happens when people are released from the visible demands of the day and can pursue whatever the evening offers. You have no evening, or rather your evening is the continuation of your day, the final tasks, the cleaning and the banking of the fire, and the check of the kitchen's readiness for tomorrow, and then the mat. The absence of an evening is not something you spend much time mourning, because mourning requires leisure, and leisure is not a feature of your situation. But sometimes, in the brief window between the last task and sleep, you feel the shape of it, the awareness that time exists somewhere, that belongs to the person who is in it, and that this shape of time is not one your day contains. The sounds of the city outside are various and familiar. You have heard them from inside this household for long enough that they function as a kind of clock, the patterns of sound that tell you where the night is without needing to look. The particular quality of the silence that settles after the late drinkers have gone home is different from the silence of the early hours before the fishmongers begin. Both kinds of silence tell you something. You read them the way you read everything in this environment, carefully, with the attention that comes from having learned that the details of the world you inhabit contain information that is useful to track. This attentiveness, this constant reading of the world, is not something you chose as a strategy. It developed because the alternative was to miss things that mattered, and missing things that mattered in this household had specific and sometimes painful consequences. You became attentive the way someone becomes fluent in a language they live inside, not through deliberate study but through the accumulated pressure of needing to understand what was being communicated. Now the attentiveness is simply part of how you perceive the world, the background mode in which you move through a day. It is, in some ways, a more thorough understanding of this household than anyone in the household's family possesses. The family knows the household as a place where things are provided and things happen and life occurs. You know it as a system, as the accumulation of small mechanical realities that make the life the family lives possible. You know where the cracks are, literally, in the kitchen wall, and which jars are beginning to lose their seal, and which pot should not be filled more than 2/3 or it will leak. You know which days are difficult and which are manageable before anyone in the family has registered the difference. This knowledge is not power exactly. It is not something you can use in any obvious way, but it is a form of comprehension, and comprehension, even when it cannot be deployed, is its own kind of possession. The story of Pasion begins where most great Athenian stories emphatically do not, in chains. He arrived in Athens sometime in the late 5th century before the Common Era, probably as a young man, probably brought there through the same brutal commercial mechanisms that supplied the city with most of its enslaved population. He was not Greek by birth. The sources disagree on where exactly he came from, Syria, possibly, or somewhere further east, though the ancient world was not always careful about such distinctions when the person in question was enslaved and therefore expected to be useful rather than documented. What we know is that he arrived without freedom, without citizenship, without property, and without any particular reason to expect that any of these things would ever change. The slave market where he was sold was, in Athens as in most Greek cities, a matter-of-fact commercial institution. Bodies were inspected, prices were negotiated, and people were purchased with the same practical attention given to any other significant transaction. There was nothing in the market's logic that distinguished a person from a commodity, because the market's logic was not designed to make that distinction. Pasion was purchased. He entered a household, and the household's needs became his life. He was purchased by two Athenian bankers named Antisthenes and Archestratus, who ran a trapeza, a banking and money-changing operation in the agora, one of the financial institutions that made the commercial life of Athens function. Banks in classical Athens were not the grand marble edifices of later centuries. They were often table, literally. The word trapeza means table, set up in the open air of the marketplace, where a skilled operator could manage currency exchange for the cosmopolitan traffic of merchants, traders, and visitors who passed through the agora carrying coins from a dozen different polis that needed to be translated into Athenian currency or into each other. The work required numeracy, a gift for rapid calculation, a memory for the relative values of dozens of different coins, and, above all, the kind of reliable trustworthiness that allowed people to hand over their money and feel confident they would receive the correct amount in return. His initial role was almost certainly as a general assistant, someone who handled the physical labour of the operation, counting coins, managing correspondence, delivering funds, maintaining accounts. The work was detailed, demanding, and required a kind of numerical literacy that not everyone in the ancient world possessed. Pasion possessed it. He was from early on exceptionally good at understanding money, not just the mechanical handling of coins, but the deeper grammar of it, why certain transactions carried risk and others did not, why a borrower's situation mattered beyond the simple fact of the loan, how reputation and relationships shaped what was possible in ways that the numbers alone could not fully capture. This was not something that could be taught quickly. It was the kind of understanding that develops through observation and attention, and a mind that is genuinely interested in how things work. Pasion's mind appears to have been genuinely interested. This is the part of the story that the ancient sources are clear about, even if they are not always clear about anything else. Pasion was trusted. Not immediately, not all at once, not as a gesture of generosity, but incrementally, through demonstrated competence, through years of reliable performance in an environment where reliability was the currency that mattered most, his employers noticed. In the world of Athenian banking, where transactions depended on trust and reputation was everything, having a slave who was trustworthy, numerate, and discreet was an asset that a careful operator would recognize and cultivate. He learned the business from the inside, which is the only way to truly learn any business. He learned which lenders were reliable and which were not. He learned how interest worked, how risk was calculated, how credit was extended, how debts were recovered. He learned the social geography of Athenian commerce, who had money, who needed it, who was in a position to help whom, and what that help would ultimately cost. He learned the names and situations of clients, the particular pressures that brought different people to a banking table, and the different things they needed when they got there. A merchant preparing a long trading voyage needed different things than a citizen managing an estate, and both needed different things than a foreigner moving through the city with currency that no one local wanted to accept. Pasion learned to read what each situation required and to provide it with a consistency that built the kind of reputation that, in commercial Athens, was worth more than almost anything else. He learned, essentially, everything that his employers knew, and then, in the way that exceptionally capable people sometimes do, he learned a little more than that. There is a question that the ancient sources do not fully answer, which is what Pasion himself felt about any of this. We have extensive documentation of what he did, of the legal disputes his estate generated, of his reputation in the city, of how the Athenian legal system thought about his various transactions. We have almost nothing of what he thought, in private, about his situation, about his owners, about the long years of serving people who held legal authority over him, while he managed their most valuable professional asset. Ancient sources do not generally record the interior lives of enslaved people. They record transactions, legal arguments, and commercial outcomes, so we are left to infer. What we can infer is that Pasion was, throughout the years of his enslavement, performing a kind of calculated patience that would have required both exceptional emotional discipline and a very clear understanding of the system he was inside. He was building something, not obviously, not declaratively, but steadily, through the accumulation of demonstrated reliability and commercial skill, through the development of relationships with clients who knew him by name and trusted him personally, through the slow construction of a reputation that would eventually outlast and outvalue his legal status as property. He was, in some sense, making himself indispensable, and he understood, probably quite clearly, that indispensability was the only form of leverage available to him. By the time Antisthenes and Archestratus were ready to retire, the most valuable thing they owned was passion. And here the story takes a turn that ancient Athens would not have considered surprising, but which the modern reader might find unexpectedly complicated. They freed him, and they gave him the bank. This was not sentimentality. This was a practical business decision made by men who understood value. Passion had made their operation what it was. He had the relationships, the knowledge, the reputation. Without him, the bank was furniture and ledgers. With him, it was a going concern. Freeing him and handing over the business preserved the value of what they had built, and almost certainly came with arrangements that continued to benefit them financially for years afterward. Generosity and calculation can look very similar from the outside when they arrive at the same decision. So Pasion became a freedman, a metic technically, one of the resident foreigners who formed a significant part of Athenian society, free but not citizens, permitted to live and work and pay taxes and serve in the military, but not to vote, not to own land, not to hold public office. He ran the bank, and he ran it extraordinarily well. The scale of what Pasion built is documented imperfectly but clearly enough in surviving Athenian legal speeches, particularly those of the orator Demosthenes, who later became tangled in disputes involving Pasion's estate. The bank held deposits from individuals and polis, city-states, across the Greek world. Pasion made loans, managed currency exchange, extended credit to merchants and travelling traders. He expanded into manufacturing, setting up a shield factory whose output supplied Athenian military needs. He accumulated property despite the legal restrictions on metic land ownership, navigating around them through mechanisms that required both ingenuity and connections. The shield factory alone tells you something important about his understanding of where durable money could be made. Athenian citizens were required to furnish their own military equipment, shields included, and the demand was steady and reliable in a way that the fluctuations of trade credit were not. Pasion understood that the most dependable commercial relationships are the ones where the need never stops. He was, by any reasonable measure, one of the wealthiest men in Athens. This is documented not with the breathless admiration of a later biographer, but with the dry precision of legal disputes over his assets, which is actually more convincing. Nobody argues extensively in court about money that does not exist. The arguments about Pasion's estate were extensive. The human texture of his life during these years of freedom and accumulation is harder to recover. He had a family. He married a woman named Archippe, and there are subsequent legal disputes suggesting their marriage was complicated by the kind of competing interests that arise when one person has accumulated substantial property and multiple parties believe they have claims to it. He had sons, including Apollodorus, who appears extensively in the legal records of the following generation, usually in the context of disputes that suggest he had inherited his father's intelligence, but was applying it in a more combative register. The relationship between Pasion and the people who managed his affairs after his own death is a story of considerable legal creativity, some of it probably dishonest, all of it testament to how much there was to dispute. And then he became something no one who had purchased him as a young man could possibly have predicted. He became an Athenian citizen. This was not automatic. Citizenship was the most jealously guarded privilege in Athens, a city whose democratic identity was in no small part about the distinction between those who belonged and those who did not. Granting it to a freed slave was not impossible, but it was rare, and it required a formal vote by the assembly, a deliberate decision by the citizen body to extend their most precious privilege to someone who had been born outside all its protections. It happened because Pasion had made himself indispensable. He had made gifts to the city in moments of crisis, contributions of money and shields and services that Athens had accepted gratefully and remembered. He had built relationships with powerful citizens who advocated for him. He had demonstrated over decades the kind of civic reliability that Athens valued in its members. The city was also, in granting him citizenship, acknowledging something that had been practically true for years, that Pasion was already operating as a full participant in Athenian economic and civic life, in every way that mattered commercially. The citizenship formalized a reality that had been developing for a long time. This too is how systems work, acknowledging what they cannot practically deny until the acknowledgement is itself useful. He did not live long after receiving citizenship. The ancient sources suggest he was already ill when the honour was granted, and he died not many years later, leaving behind an estate that his son Apollodorus would spend decades defending in court against what appear to have been increasingly creative legal challenges. The litigation surrounding Pasion's wealth is, in its own way, a kind of testament to how substantial that wealth was. People do not spend generations arguing over nothing. There was a man named Phormion who had managed the bank and other assets during Pasion's later years and who, after Pasion's death, became entangled in legal disputes with Apollodorus that generated some of the most detailed surviving evidence about Athenian banking practice. Phormion had himself been enslaved, had been trusted and eventually freed, and had eventually married Archippe, Pasion's widow, in an arrangement that appeared to have been part of Pasion's own planning for what would happen after he was gone. The parallel is striking enough to suggest that Pasion, in structuring his succession, drew on his own experience, the pattern by which a capable enslaved person earns trust, earns freedom, earns position, and eventually inherits a role that their former owner builds for them. He had lived that pattern. He recreated it. What do we make of Pasion? The temptation is to read his story as triumph, a narrative of exceptional individual ability overcoming extraordinary circumstances. And there is truth in that reading. He was, by any account, remarkable. His abilities were real, his achievements were genuine. The arc from enslaved foreign labourer to Athenian citizen banker is one of the more improbable trajectories in the ancient record. But Pasion's story is also, if you look at it carefully, a story about what slavery required people to become in order to survive it. He was not freed because Athens had concluded that slavery was wrong. He was not given citizenship because the assembly had experienced a collective crisis of conscience. He was freed and elevated because he had made himself too valuable to remain in chains, because he had served his owners so well and so completely that releasing him was the rational choice, because the system had extracted from him everything it could, and then, when no more could be extracted in that form, had found a new form in which to benefit from his existence. He won in the terms available to him. He won comprehensively, in ways almost no one in his situation ever managed, and the fact that he could only win by making himself irreplaceable to the people who owned him tells you something about the system he was winning inside, something that his remarkable individual story both illuminates and, if you're not careful, obscures. The one in 1,000 who escapes does not redeem the system that held the other, 999. It sometimes just makes the system easier to accept. He's buried somewhere in Athens, a citizen of the city he arrived in as property. The bank continued, the shield factory continued, the legal disputes continued, and Athens continued, vast and golden and built on the labour of people who mostly did not get to leave a name behind. The banking world that Pasion inherited and then expanded was one of the more genuinely cosmopolitan institutions, in a city that was itself unusually cosmopolitan by ancient standards. Athens in the 5th and 4th centuries drew people from across the Greek world and beyond, merchants and craftsmen and mercenaries and scholars and everyone else who followed trade or opportunity or reputation. The agora was a genuinely international space, where transactions happened in a dozen currencies and disputes arose from the collision of different commercial customs, and where a banker who could read all of these situations and navigate among them had access to a range of business that no locally focused operation could match. Pasion read all of these situations. He had arrived in Athens as a foreigner and spent years learning its systems from the inside, which meant he understood the city's commercial culture with the clarity that comes from having to learn it deliberately, rather than simply having grown up inside it. He also understood, from his own experience, the situation of foreign merchants passing through, the particular vulnerability of someone who is not embedded in the local social networks that protect citizens from the worst commercial outcomes, who needs credit or currency exchange or safekeeping for valuables, and does not have the personal relationships that a citizen would have to determine who to trust. He had been that person, in a different sense, and the understanding translated into a commercial advantage. He knew what foreign traders needed. He provided it reliably. Word travelled, as reliable commercial services in the ancient world always travelled, along the same routes as the trade itself. The shield factory that Pasion established alongside the banking operation is a detail that rewards attention. Athens was a city that spent a great deal of its history at war, or preparing for war, or recovering from war, and the demand for military equipment was both substantial and remarkably consistent. Shields in the ancient world were not simple objects. They required skilled manufacture, quality materials, and the kind of reliable output that only a dedicated operation could provide. If you like the video so far, please leave us a like and a sub. A sub to the channel helps us make more videos for you to watch and keep the channel alive. Pasion's factory supplied a product that the city needed, in quantities the city needed, over an extended period. He understood that the most durable commercial relationships are the ones where the need is structural rather than situational, where you are providing something that the customer cannot do without rather than something they can choose to forego when times are difficult. The city of Athens was going to need shields whether the market for banking services was good or not. This diversification tells you something about how Pasion thought. He did not simply expand the business he had inherited. He built a different kind of enterprise, one with multiple sources of income, multiple relationships with different parts of the city's economy, multiple points of contact with the social and political structures that determined commercial success. He was not just a banker who happened to be very good at banking. He was constructing a commercial presence that was embedded in the city's needs in enough places that it would be difficult to dislodge. There were inevitably legal disputes. Athenian commercial life was saturated with litigation, partly because Athens had a legal system that made litigation accessible, and partly because the legal system's accessibility created incentives to use it aggressively in commercial disputes where a favourable judgment could be valuable. Pasion was involved in several cases that survive in the oratorical record, most of them relating to loans and deposits, and the various disagreements that arise when money changes hands and the parties to the transaction later remember the terms differently. One case involved a man named Apollodorus, not Pasion's son of the same name but a different man, who alleged that Pasion had mishandled a deposit. The specifics of the dispute are reconstructible from surviving speeches, though as with most ancient legal disputes, the surviving evidence comes from one side only, and needs to be read with appropriate caution. What the case reveals, regardless of the specific merits, is that Pasion was operating at a scale where disputes of this kind were both inevitable and manageable, where he had the commercial standing and the social connections to contest accusations without being destroyed by them. This too was a form of power that had to be built over time and that was not available to people who had not built it. The social position of a successful metic in Athens was genuinely strange in ways that do not quite map onto categories that modern readers find familiar. Pasion, even after accumulating enormous wealth, even after developing the kind of commercial relationships that gave him access to the most powerful citizens in Athens, was still formally a resident alien, still outside the political community, still unable to own land in his own name or vote or serve in public office. He paid taxes. He could be required to contribute to public expenses that fell on wealthy residents. He had obligations to the city. He had very few of the city's formal protections in return. This was the position that all metics occupied, from the successful merchant to the skilled craftsman who had settled in Athens for opportunities the city provided. There were tens of thousands of metics in Athens during the classical period, an enormous number, and their economic contribution to the city was substantial enough that Athens was careful not to make their situation so difficult that they left. But they remained outside, in the formal sense, the community whose well-being the democracy was organised to promote. Pasion navigated this with a care that the record, even imperfectly, makes visible. He made his gifts to the city at the moments when gifts would be most noticed and most valued, during military crises when resources were short and contributions were remembered. He cultivated relationships with citizens who had the social standing to speak on his behalf before the assembly. He was visible in the right places and in the right ways, which is a skill that requires both social intelligence and sustained attention. He was, in some sense, always auditioning, making the case through the accumulation of his actions over years that he was the kind of person the city should want to claim as its own. The citizenship, when it came, was recognition of a case that had been building for decades. It It was also, for a man who had been purchased as property in that same city, something that defies easy description. The documents do not give us his inner life at the moment of the Assembly's vote. They give us the fact of it, the political act, the legal change in status. What Pasion made of it privately, what the distance between arriving as property and leaving as citizen meant to him in terms that were not commercial or political but simply human, that belongs to the silence that the ancient record maintained around the inner lives of people who had been enslaved. He arranged his affairs with the same deliberateness that had characterized his entire life. The trusteeship of the bank, the provisions for his wife, the management of the shield factory, the instructions for how disputes should be resolved, these were the actions of a man who understood that the institutions he had built would outlast him, and that outlasting him in a form he could still shape was better than outlasting him in a form he could not. He had spent his life building something in a city that had initially treated him as something to be built with. The management of its continuation was one last act of agency in a life that had required enormous quantities of it. The question of what Pasion's Athenian contemporaries made of him is one that the sources hint at without fully answering. He appears in the speeches of Demosthenes as a figure whose commercial practices are worth examining in detail, whose reputation for reliability was apparently well established, whose name carried weight in commercial circles across the Greek world. He appears in other sources as an example of what a metic could achieve in Athens, sometimes cited in ways that suggest genuine admiration, and sometimes in ways that suggest that the admiration itself was slightly unsettling to the people expressing it. A former slave who had become more commercially successful than most citizens was a fact that Athens could accommodate within its institutional categories, because the categories were flexible enough, but that sat somewhat uncomfortably with the city's self-understanding. Athens believed, in a way that was deeply structural, that the capacity for rational self-governance was correlated with social position, that citizens were citizens partly because they possessed the qualities that citizenship required. Pasion complicated this belief without directly challenging it. He had been property and become a citizen, which meant that the trajectory itself was possible, which meant that the categories were more permeable than the ideology suggested. Athens dealt with this by treating Pasion as an exceptional case, by celebrating him in a way that implicitly suggested he had proven himself to be an exception to the general rule, rather than evidence that the general rule was wrong. Individual exceptions are considerably easier to absorb than institutional critiques. The commercial world that Pasion operated within was one that understood reputation in a way that modern observers sometimes miss. In the ancient Mediterranean, credit was personal before it was institutional. There was no credit bureau, no standardized record of financial behavior, no formal verification system for claims about financial reliability. There were networks of relationship and recommendation, where a merchant in Corinth could ask a contact in Athens about a potential trading partner and receive through that network an assessment of whether the person was trustworthy based on the accumulated experience of people who had done business with them. Into this network, Pasion had inserted himself with considerable skill, cultivating relationships that extended his reputation beyond the agora of Athens into the wider commercial world of the Greek Mediterranean. This mattered because it created a commercial reach that was difficult to replicate without years of relationship building. A new bank, operated by someone without Pasion's established reputation, could not simply announce itself and expect to attract the scale of deposits and loan requests that Pasion's operation commanded. Reputation was the asset, and reputation was built slowly through every individual transaction that was handled correctly, every promise that was kept, every crisis that was managed without disaster. The bank's ledgers showed the financial outcomes. The ledgers did not show the decades of correct behavior that made those outcomes possible. The shield factory, which Pasion had added to the banking operation, and which eventually employed significant numbers of workers, tells us something about his thinking about risk and about the nature of commercial relationships with the city. Banking was a business that depended on commercial cycles and on the creditworthiness of borrowers, neither of which were fully within Pasion's control. The shield factory depended on military demand, which was partly under Athens' control and partly not, but which was considerably more predictable in a city that was either fighting a war, recovering from a war, or preparing for the next one in every decade of the classical period. The factory gave the operation a stable floor of income that could support the banking side through periods when credit conditions were difficult and the appetite for commercial lending was reduced. The workers in the shield factory were, in many cases, enslaved. We do not have detailed records of the factory's labour force, but the pattern in Athenian manufacturing was consistent enough that it is reasonable to assume enslaved workers composed a significant portion of it. Pasion, who had arrived in Athens as property, operated a manufacturing business that depended in part on people who were property. This is not hypocrisy exactly. It is the way that systems work on people who live inside them. Pasion was not building a different kind of world. He was building a better position within the world that existed. The world that existed ran on enslaved labour, and building a successful commercial operation within it meant using enslaved labour, because that was how successful commercial operations in Athens were built. He did what the system required to succeed in it. That this meant participating in the same institution that had once defined his own legal status is a fact that says more about the institution than about him. What Pasion understood, more clearly than most people who had not been where he had been, was the gap between legal status and actual capacity. He had spent years as property with the full commercial and social capabilities of a person, and he had spent years as a free man but a metic, with freedom but without citizenship, and he had finally spent a brief period as a citizen with everything the status implied. These transitions gave him an unusually clear view of how much of what Athens said about the connection between legal status and human quality was simply an institutional arrangement rather than a natural fact. He had been the same person through all of these legal categories. The categories had changed what he could do and what others could do to him. They had not changed what he was. Let us go underground now. Let us go to a place where the light does not reach, and the air does not move, and the walls press in with a closeness that has nothing comforting about it whatsoever. Let us go to Laurion. You descend into the mine as you do every morning, which is to say without enthusiasm and without any real alternative. The entrance is a vertical shaft cut into the hillside of the Attic Peninsula, southeast of Athens, and getting into it requires a wooden ladder that you have already decided does not deserve your trust. You go down anyway, because the people at the top of the shaft have made clear, in terms that do not require detailed elaboration, that going down is the expectation, and the expectation is not optional. The shaft narrows as you go deeper, and the light from the surface diminishes in stages, like a conversation gradually running out of things to say. By the time you reach the working level, the light is provided entirely by small clay lamps burning olive oil, and there are not enough of them, and the ones that exist cast shadows that are more reassuring than the dark they are holding back. Your eyes adjust. They have adjusted every morning for longer than you have been counting mornings, because counting mornings is a habit that stops being useful at a certain point. The air at the bottom of the shaft is not the same air as above. It is thicker, warmer, laden with the smell of rock dust and lamp smoke, and the particular human smell of people working in enclosed spaces without access to the kind of hygiene that the citizens of Athens, above ground, in the sunlight, consider a basic feature of civilization. You breathe it because it is what there is to breathe. Your lungs have long since stopped protesting in any meaningful way. They have adopted a resigned professionalism that you find either admirable or deeply concerning depending on which hour of the day it is. The gallery you work in is narrow enough that you move through it with your body angled sideways, your shoulders brushing both walls if you're not careful about your position. The ceiling is low. You learned on your first day to move with your head slightly bowed, which after enough time stops being a posture you consciously assume and simply becomes the shape your body takes in this place, as though you are carrying something heavy on top of you, which in a sense you always are. The rock above you weighs everything. You do not think about this if you can avoid it. The miners who do think about it tend to work with a certain visible agitation that makes them less efficient and does not, as far as you can observe, improve the situation. The silver at Laurion sits inside a layer of ore sandwiched between rock, and getting to it requires the application of a pick against stone for hours at a time, in a space where the act of swinging that pick demands a physical ingenuity that nobody mentions when they describe the wealth of Athens. You crouch, or you lie on your side, or you find the particular arrangement of limbs that gives you the most leverage within the available space, and you work. The pick connects with stone, chips fall, dust rises. You turn your face slightly away from the worst of it, because the alternative is to breathe rock directly, and even here, even in this, there are habits that preserve something. The dust is everywhere. It is in your hair and in the creases of your hands and in the back of your throat in a way that no amount of water quite reaches. After enough time in the mine, you stop coughing in response to it. Not because it has stopped being there, but because your body has reclassified it from irritant to background condition. The same way it reclassified the smell and the temperature and the particular ache in your back that arrives every morning and stays until well after you have left the shaft. The body is very good at reclassifying things as normal. This is what the body does when it has no other available strategy. The noise inside the galleries is a combination of sounds that you have completely stopped noticing in the way you have completely stopped noticing your own heartbeat. The steady percussion of picks against stone, echoing down the shafts and returning altered, layered on top of itself until it becomes a kind of continuous thunder that lives in the walls. The occasional crack of stone giving way in a way that makes everyone pause for exactly 1 second before continuing. The sound of ore being loaded into baskets, the scrape of wood on rock, the movement of people through the narrow passages, the voices of the overseers, which carry a particular acoustic quality underground that makes them louder than they have any right to be. You have noticed that the overseers do not come far into the galleries. They stand at the entrances just inside the light. This tells you something about the galleries, though it is not information that changes your situation. Your task is to extract ore. The ore is then carried to the surface in baskets, processed through a system of crushing, washing and smelting that happens outside in the open air where the fumes can dissipate, and the workers doing that processing get to see the sky. You're not doing that processing, you are here, inside the hill, in the part of the operation that the sky does not reach. The quota is the governing fact of your day. There is a weight of ore that must be produced, and the system around you tracks whether it is being produced, and the consequences of falling short are calibrated in a way that ensures no one falls short for long. You work at a pace that is not sustainable in the sense that human bodies are not built for this, but is sustainable in the sense that you have in fact sustained it, day after day, which has given you a practical understanding of your own limits that is more precise than you would ever have wanted. You know how much you can do before your arms begin to fail. You know the signs, the slight trembling in the shoulder muscles that precedes the more serious failure. The way the pick begins to feel heavier in your hands as the morning wears on. You pace yourself against these signals the way a careful traveller paces against the distance remaining. Breaks are brief. There is water, brought down by young boys who move through the galleries faster than you because they are smaller, and the galleries were, in places, designed for them. This is not an accident. Some of the narrowest passages require workers whose bodies do not exceed certain dimensions, and Athens addressed this problem in the way Athens addressed most labour problems, which is to say efficiently and without excessive concern for the workers in question. The water is warm by the time it reaches you. You drink it. This is not a moment of luxury. It is a maintenance task performed on a body that is required to continue functioning. Your hands are the part of you that have changed the most. They were not always like this. The palms thick and ridged, the knuckles enlarged, the fingers that ache in the night in a way that is different from tiredness and suggests something more structural. They do what is asked of them. They grip the pick. They load the basket. They press against the stone to brace your position when the angle requires it. They are very good at their job. This is not a comfort, but it is a fact, and facts are things you register. The mines at Laurion are not new when you arrive in them. Athens has been extracting silver from this hill for generations, and the scale of the operation is, if you step back far enough to see it properly, extraordinary. Hundreds of shafts, kilometres of galleries bored into the hillside at various depths, following the seams of silver-bearing ore as they twist and thin and widen. The surface of the area around Laurion is marked by the accumulated evidence of this activity, the crushed ore, the washing facilities, the smelting furnaces whose smoke rises into the attic sky in a column that people can see from some distance away, like a signal fire burning for no particular good news. Tens of thousands of workers across the whole complex, most of them enslaved, most of them leased to the mining contractors by private owners who collect the rental income without needing to come anywhere near the place. There is a casualness to this arrangement that says something important about how Athens thought about the people inside the hill. An owner leases a slave to a mine operator for a fixed annual fee, collects the fee, and does not ask questions about what the mine operation entails, or what condition the slave will be in at the end of the year, if the slave is alive at the end of the year. The mine operator extracts as much work as possible from the least labour, which is rational from the operator's perspective in the same way that it is terrible from the workers. The operation produces silver that is minted into the famous Athenian coins, the tetradrachm, the ones with Athena on one side and her owl on the other, that traders across the Mediterranean used as a standard of exchange precisely because Athenian silver was reliable and the city produced enough of it to make it ubiquitous. These coins funded the navy. They funded the public building program that produced the Parthenon and the other monuments on the Acropolis. They funded the festivals and the dramatic competitions and the civic projects that gave Athens its cultural reputation. The city's ability to project military power and cultural influence across the Greek world in the 5th century, before the Common Era, was built on the productivity of the Laurion mines in a way that its most admiring historians have not always seen fit to emphasize. You're inside the thing that pays for all of it. This is not a source of pride, it is a geological fact. There is a particular kind of exhaustion that develops in people who do this work for long enough, and it is not simply tiredness. It is something more thorough, a fatigue that settles into the structure of the body rather than sitting on the surface of it. It changes the way you move and the way you breathe and the way your hands behave when you're not actively directing them. You feel it in the evenings, when the shift ends and you climb back up the ladder toward the light, which is always a shock even when you know it is coming. The sky is suddenly enormous, and the air is suddenly movable, and the temperature is suddenly a fact again rather than an abstraction. Your body, in those first minutes above ground, seems unsure of what to do with the information that the world is larger than the gallery. The light hurts, at first, every time. Your eyes have been working all day in the orange warmth of clay lamps, and the attic evening light, even as it softens towards sunset, is more than your pupils are immediately prepared for. You squint. You let the adjustment happen. You stand on the surface of the earth with the same slightly bewildered quality that people have when they emerge from long enclosed spaces, as though the world has rearranged itself slightly while you are not watching, as though you need a moment to relearn the rules of it. You eat whatever has been provided, which is calibrated to the amount of work required of you in a way that is practical rather than generous. Enough to continue, not more than that. The food at Laurion is not the same as the food in the city. It is plainer, less varied, measured out with the efficiency of a system that treats nutrition as a production input rather than an experience. You eat without particular attention, because hunger at the end of a mine shift is not the subtle conversational hunger of a missed meal, but something more direct and demanding, and it wants resolution rather than contemplation. You sleep in the sleeping areas near the mine because the walk to Athens is too long, and the economics of the situation do not include travel time. The sleeping area is crowded and loud with the breathing and movement of people in the particular sleep of exhaustion, which is deep but not restful in any way that repairs the things that need repairing. You fall into it quickly, which is the one advantage of this kind of tiredness. It does not permit the prolonged negotiations with consciousness that lighter fatigue allows. You simply go. And then the morning comes and you go down again. This is the rhythm of Laurion, and it is a rhythm that has no natural ending point built into it. There is no moment when the mine is satisfied, no completion that releases you. The seams of ore extend into the hill, and the hill continues, and the quota continues, and the system continues. You are a component of that continuation, replaceable, predictable, expected to produce until you cannot. The mine has been running for generations before you arrived, and will run for generations after you're gone, and the hill itself will outlast everyone currently inside it by a margin that is embarrassing to contemplate. The geology of Laurion is specific, and its specificity matters to understanding why the mines are where they are, and why they required the kind of labour they did. The silver ore at Laurion occurs in a narrow band of ore-bearing rock, argentiferous galena, sandwiched between marble and a type of limestone called schist. The band is not uniform. It thickens and thins as it follows the natural variation of the ancient seabed that eventually became this hill. Following it required constant adjustment, the galleries bending and descending in response to where the ore went rather than where it would be convenient to dig. This is why the galleries are shaped the way they are, narrow, low, twisting. Not designed for human comfort, because they were not designed at all in any sense that considered the humans who would be working in them. They were carved in the shape of the ore, and the ore had no interest in ergonomics. The technical process of extracting silver from Laurion ore was not simple, and the scale at which Athens conducted it in the classical period was one of the more significant industrial operations in the ancient Mediterranean. The ore had to be mined, which you know from the inside. It then had to be crushed, which happened at large grinding installations on the surface, flat stone mills where ore was reduced to a fine powder. The powder was washed in a system of tanks designed to separate the heavier silver-bearing material from the lighter rock waste using water flow, a process that required a continuous supply of water in a region that was not abundantly provided with it, and that explains the elaborate cistern systems archaeologists have found throughout the Laurion area. The concentrated ore was then smelted in furnaces that reached very high temperatures and produced the kind of smoke that makes the air around a smelting operation something you would not choose to breathe if you had a choice about it. If you like the video so far, please leave us a like and a sub. A sub to the channel helps us make more videos for you to watch and keep the channel alive. The workers at the surface operations at Laurion had different problems than the workers underground. They had light and air, which are not small things. They did not have the particular claustrophobia of the galleries, or the complete dependency on artificial light, or the constant anxiety about what the rock above them was doing. What they had instead was heat from the furnaces, and the fumes, heavy metals suspended in smoke that the body absorbs without announcing that it is doing so, and the steady physical demand of work that was less confined than the mining, but no less exhausting in its own way. They also had slightly more social exposure, slightly more opportunity to interact with the broader world of the mining complex, which in the ancient world of enclosed slave populations was not a trivial difference. You are underground. The surface workers are someone else's story, happening above you while you excavate, distantly aware of the sunlight above as an abstraction you are currently separated from. The sound of the pick striking stone has a rhythm that your body has internalized over time, not exactly music, but something that functions similarly in the way it organizes time and gives the body's movement a structure to follow. The rhythm is partly practical. It is more efficient to swing with a regularity that allows the muscles to anticipate and prepare than to strike randomly, and partly it becomes a kind of meditation, the mind able to enter a particular state of focused emptiness when the body is fully occupied with a repetitive physical task. You have been in this state for hours today, the pick rising and falling, the stone giving way in chips and fragments, the body doing what it has been trained to do, the mind somewhere else and also nowhere, present in a way that is not quite thinking. When the rhythm breaks, you notice it immediately. A chip of stone that hits at a different angle, a change in the sound that the rock makes when struck, which tells you something about what lies behind it, whether the seam continues or thins or twists. Your hands and ears have become instruments of geological information in a way that the overseer at the gallery entrance cannot match, because the overseer is not the one in contact with the stone. This is a kind of expertise. You would not have chosen to develop it in the circumstances in which you developed it, but it is real, and it is yours, and the mind depends on it in a way that the mind's administrators do not entirely acknowledge, because acknowledging it would complicate the narrative that what is happening here is essentially simple. There are other workers in the gallery, not many. The passages are too narrow for large groups to work efficiently, but enough that you are aware of them as presences, as sounds, as the occasional brush of a shoulder in the narrowest sections, as the mutual accommodation that people in close quarters develop automatically. You do not talk much in the gallery. The noise makes conversation difficult and the overseers do not encourage it, and there is not much to say that the situation does not say more eloquently on its own. But there is a kind of communication that does not require language. The shared awareness of a difficult environment, the small adjustments that prevent collision in the passages, the awareness of each other's condition that allows one person to notice when another is struggling in a way that might become a problem for both of them. The people in the gallery with you come from everywhere. This is characteristic of the Laurion workforce in the classical period, a genuinely international mix assembled by the slave trade from Thrace, from the Black Sea coast, from Asia Minor, from places further east, from the Greek world's various wars and piracy operations that turned people into commodities. Languages that have nothing to do with each other coexist in these passages. You have learned a handful of phrases in several of them, enough to communicate the most basic operational information, because operational information is what matters here, and the mind does not wait for full linguistic fluency to be established. This linguistic diversity, which must have been bewildering to everyone who arrived at Laurion initially, eventually produces its own pidgin, its own compressed vocabulary of mining terms and physical necessities, and the social markers that allow people to read each other's intentions in situations where misreading is dangerous. You speak this language fluently now. It is not the language of any particular culture. It is the language of this particular place, developed for this particular set of requirements, and it will not survive beyond the mine because it was made for the mine. The world above the mine is not a world you have lost access to permanently, in the sense that the shift ends and you ascend and the surface is there, the sky and the air and the light and the sounds of the open world. But the above-ground world has a quality of unreality after enough time underground, a brightness and openness and possibility of movement that the mine does not provide, and after a while the above-ground world begins to feel like the temporary state, and the mine feels like the primary reality, which is a shift in your relationship to the world that you notice without being able to do much about. The mine is where most of your hours go. It is where your body's knowledge lives, in the muscles that know how to grip the pick, and the ears that know how to read the stone, and the body that knows how to fit itself into spaces that are not designed for bodies. The above-ground world is where the shift ends. The mine is where the shift is. The sound of water, when you hear it in the gallery, is both welcome and alarming. Welcome because you are thirsty, and the water means something to drink. Alarming because water in a mine gallery does not always stay where the mine wants it to stay. The Laurion mines dealt with water intrusion as a chronic engineering problem, water seeping through the rock from the rain above, from underground sources that the digging had intersected, requiring a constant effort of drainage that added to the labour of the operation, and that, when it failed, could fill a gallery with dangerous speed. You have not experienced this directly, but you have heard enough from the people who have to understand that the combination of enclosed space and sudden water is one of the things the mine can do that you cannot respond to effectively. So you drink the water the boys bring down, and you're aware of it when you hear it in the walls and you work and the shift continues. The physical evidence of Laurion is still there. Archaeologists have been examining the site for over a century and have documented thousands of mine shafts, hundreds of surface installations, the remains of the ore processing facilities, the cisterns, the furnaces. Walking across the landscape of the Laurion Peninsula today, you move over a surface that has been almost completely transformed by the ancient mining operation. The topsoil, long since disturbed, the underlying geology exposed in places, the entire environment bearing the marks of what happened here over centuries. The landscape itself is a record of the labour, not written down but cut into the earth in a way that the earth has not forgotten. Inside the galleries, archaeologists have found the tools of the workers, picks made of iron, oil lamps of clay, the occasional personal object that was left behind or lost, things that give you a specific physical connection to the people who move through these passages. The picks are worn in ways that show use, the handles shaped and reshaped to fit the hands that held them. The lamps are simple but carefully made, designed to burn for hours with the available fuel. These are not the objects of a luxury economy. They are the objects of an operation that cared about efficiency and continuity, that needed the tools to function reliably because the schedule depended on them and the quota depended on the schedule. You have learned the lamps. You know how long yours will burn before it needs refilling, and you track this the way you track everything in the gallery, as a piece of operational information that matters. A lamp that dies unexpectedly in the interior of a gallery leaves you in a darkness that is absolute in a way that surface darkness is not. There is no ambient light here, no starlight, no reflected light from adjacent spaces. The darkness of the mine is total when the lamp goes out, and navigating in it requires either a detailed memory of the passage's geometry, or the willingness to stay completely still until someone with a functioning lamp comes to you, neither of which is an especially comfortable situation when the quota is still outstanding. So you track the lamp. You know the rhythm of it, how the flame behaves when the oil's getting low, how long you have when you see that behaviour begin. You refill before the crisis rather than after it. This is the kind of practical management that the mine produces in the people it employs, a thorough and unsentimental attention to the operational details that determine whether the day goes smoothly or poorly. The mine has made you efficient in ways that have nothing to do with any quality you arrived with and everything to do with what it has required of you. The ore that comes out of the gallery you work in is loaded into baskets that boys and smaller workers carry to the surface. You have watched these boys, many of them young enough that the full meaning of their situation has not entirely settled over them, moving through the narrower passages with a practiced ease that makes the gallery look more navigable than it is. They know the passages, have memorised them the way children memorise the terrain of the places they inhabit, and they move through them quickly, the basket balanced, the body already learning the particular physical grammar of this environment. Some of them have been here since they were small enough to fit in the narrowest passages and have grown up in them, and the mine is the landscape of their entire conscious life, the only geography their body knows well. This is perhaps the most disturbing fact about Laurion. Not that adults were sent into it, adults who had at least the theoretical possibility of having known something different, but that the operation was calibrated to use children in the narrowest passages and that children were, by the logic of the institution, available for this calibration. There was no age below which the mine considered someone too young for the work. There was only the question of whether the body fit the passage and whether the body could carry the basket. These questions were answered in the affirmative for bodies that were very small. You're not small, you're in the part of the gallery where the passages are wide enough for an adult to move, which is wide in relative terms only, and you work the ore with the pick and load the basket when it is full and wait for the boy to take it. The boy arrives, takes it, disappears back down the passage toward the surface. You begin again. This is the cycle. It will repeat for the duration of the shift and then stop for the night and begin again tomorrow. The sounds outside the gallery sometimes carry in through the shaft system in distorted fragments. A voice, raised somewhere above, arriving in the gallery as a murmur without words. The sound of something being moved on the surface, translated by the rock into something unrecognisable. Occasionally, on still days, something like the sound of wind, which does not feel entirely real when you are this far underground, but which the body responds to anyway. A small involuntary lift of the attention toward the surface, toward the source of air and sky and temperature change that the body has not forgotten, even when the mind is entirely occupied with the work directly in front of it. The body remembers things that the mind has moved past. Your body remembers surfaces, open air, the particular quality of movement that is possible when the space around you is not pressing in from every side. It remembers these things in moments of stillness, in the brief pauses between one basket being taken and the next being loaded, in the seconds when your arms are resting, and the pick is down and there is a half-breath of space before the next movement. In those moments, the body sends up its signals, not as complaint exactly, more as information, a status report. This is what is missing. This is what we are not currently receiving. Noted, logged, continuing regardless. You are continuing regardless. This is what you do. The pick rises and falls, the stone gives way in pieces, the ore goes into the basket. The day moves forward with the slow inevitability of a process that does not have an ending, only a shift change, and after the shift change, another shift, and after that the kind of rest that is not rest, and then another morning at the top of the ladder. Above ground, in the workshops and harbours and households of Athens, the system that sent you underground was operating in dozens of other forms simultaneously. Understanding what slavery actually was in ancient Greece requires, first, letting go of the idea that it was simple, because simple it definitively was not, and the complications are the thing that makes it most disturbing to look at clearly. Athens in the 5th and 4th centuries before the Common Era was home to a slave population that scholars estimate at somewhere between 30 and 40% of the total inhabitants, though the numbers are debated and the ancient sources are inconsistent in ways that historians have spent careers trying to reconcile. What is not debated is that enslaved people were everywhere in Athenian life, in every industry, every household, every institution, performing every category of labour from the most dangerous to the most intimate. They ground the grain and fired the pottery and tended the olive groves and rowed the warships in battle, and managed the financial accounts of wealthy citizens and taught the children of citizens and carried the sick and staffed the workshops and built the walls and quarried the stone that made the buildings and then built those buildings too. There was essentially no part of Athenian economic or domestic life that did not depend on enslaved labour at some point in its operation. The city was not built with enslaved labour as one component among several. The city was built in the most direct and practical sense by enslaved people. The sources of this population were varied, and the variation matters. War captives were a significant source. When Athens defeated an enemy in battle, the surviving population of the defeated city could be enslaved, the men killed or taken, the women and children sold, their entire social existence liquidated into a commercial transaction in which they were the commodity. Piracy was another source, operating with a commercial efficiency that the Athenians found perfectly acceptable as long as the people being captured were not Athenians. There was a trade network, vast and organised, that moved enslaved people from Thrace, Scythia, Asia Minor, the Black Sea coast, and elsewhere into the slave markets of Athens and other Greek cities, where they were sold with the matter-of-fact commercial routines that any other commodity would attract. Prices varied by skill, age, and perceived temperament, in ways that the surviving sources document with the same dry precision they apply to the price of grain or timber. Children born to enslaved parents were enslaved. The institution reproduced itself biologically as well as commercially. The categories of work performed by enslaved people in Athens were not uniform, and the conditions varied enormously depending on the category. A skilled craftsman who was enslaved and allowed to work in his own shop, paying a portion of his earnings to his owner in the arrangement known as living apart, lived a life materially different from a mine worker at Laurion. A trusted household slave who had served a family for decades occupied a different social position than someone newly purchased at the slave market in the agora. A slave employed as a public slave by the city of Athens itself, working in administration, or serving in the corps of Scythian archers who policed the city and maintained order at public gatherings, an Athenian institution that surprises most modern readers, had freedoms and social standing that a privately owned agricultural labourer would not recognise as belonging to the same category of existence. The Scythian archers, bought and maintained by the city to do what citizen soldiers found beneath them, functioned as a kind of municipal police force with a status that was simultaneously privileged within the slave population and completely outside the political community whose order they enforced. This variability was not an accident. It was a feature of the system, and it served important functions. Variation created the possibility of aspiration, or something that looked like aspiration. If conditions were uniformly terrible, the system would have required constant, exhausting, and expensive enforcement at every level. By allowing gradations, by making it possible for a skilled or trusted slave to achieve a somewhat better situation, the system encouraged compliance, performance, and even, in some cases, a kind of loyalty that owners found useful and economists would recognise as a productivity mechanism. The possibility of eventual freedom, however rare and difficult, served a similar function. It gave people a reason to behave in ways the system found useful, rather than in ways the system found costly to manage. Incentives do not require genuine freedom to be effective. They require only the convincing appearance of a path towards something better. This is the part of the conversation about Athenian slavery that is important not to sanitize. The variation in conditions was real. Some enslaved people in Athens did achieve better situations, were trusted, were given responsibilities, were ultimately freed. Pasion is the extreme example of what that could look like. But the variation existed within a system whose foundations were coercive, whose ultimate authority was violence, and whose logic required that the majority of enslaved people remain in conditions that allowed them no real autonomy, no security, and no claim on the future. The kindly owner and the trusted slave do not change the architecture of the institution. They are, if anything, the institution's most effective advertisement, the evidence it offers that things are not as bad as they might appear, the proof it deploys against its own examination. There was no Athenian abolitionist movement. This is worth sitting with. The thinkers who were doing their most significant work in Athens during this period, the philosophers who are still read and taught and cited in university lecture halls today, almost entirely accepted slavery as a natural feature of human social organisation. Aristotle, writing in the 4th century, argued directly that some people were slaves by nature, that the capacity for rational self-governance was distributed unequally among human beings, and that some people simply did not possess enough of it to manage their own lives, and were therefore better off being managed by others whose capacity was greater. This was not a fringe view offered tentatively and quickly withdrawn. It was a position that Aristotle developed at some length and defended against objections, a considered philosophical argument from one of the most sophisticated and comprehensive thinkers of the ancient world. He was wrong. he was also operating from within a social system that provided him with enormous incentives to reach that particular conclusion, which does not excuse the conclusion, but helps explain how a mind of that caliber arrived at it. Plato was more ambivalent. His dialogues occasionally register discomfort with aspects of the institution, occasionally give enslaved characters something like voice and dignity, occasionally raise questions that could, if pressed in a certain direction, become uncomfortable for the institution itself, but they are never pressed that far. The questions dissolve back into other discussions. The discomfort resolves into something more manageable. The system remains in place in the dialogues as it remains in place in Athens, unexamined at its foundations, treated as the water in which everything else swims. What the philosophers did engage with sometimes was the question of what made a free person free, what distinguished the citizen from the slave, what the proper basis of political participation was, and here the logic becomes circular in ways that should make the reader uncomfortable. The Athenian citizen was free, in part because he did not need to do the degrading manual labour that was the lot of slaves and lower classes. He was free to participate in political life because his household ran on enslaved labour that managed the domestic economy, so he did not have to. He was free to pursue philosophy because someone else was hauling water and grinding grain and descending into the mine. The freedom of the citizen was not independent of the unfreedom of the slave. It was constructed on top of it, enabled by it, dependent on it, in a structural sense that the philosophy preferred not to examine directly. The democracy of Athens, celebrated then and still celebrated now as one of the foundational achievements of human political history, was a democracy of a particular class of people in a particular city who had organised their economic and domestic lives so that the labour required to sustain them was performed by people who had no political voice whatsoever. Citizens deliberated in the assembly, sometimes at great length, on questions that included the proper treatment of subject peoples, the ethics of military action, the obligations of justice. Citizens served on juries of hundreds, deciding cases according to a legal system that Athens considered one of its great civic achievements. Citizens debated in the agora and attended the dramatic festivals and voted on ostracism and argued about the nature of the good society. And citizens went home to households maintained by enslaved labour, to meals prepared by enslaved hands, to economic enterprises built on enslaved bodies and sustained by the kind of availability that only people without alternatives can provide. The legal status of an enslaved person in Athens was, formally, that of property. This was not merely rhetorical. It was the operational logic of the entire legal system's relationship to enslaved people. They could not own property, could not enter into contracts, could not marry legally, could not have their family relationships recognised by law. An enslaved person who was harmed by someone other than their owner could seek legal redress only through their owner, because the harm was understood as damage to property rather than injury to a person. If you attacked a slave, you were liable to the slave's owner, not to the slave. The slave's suffering was real. The slave's legal injury was to someone else's pocket. This had practical implications that ran through every part of life. A man and a woman who were both enslaved and lived together as a couple had no legal relationship. Their children belonged to the owner, not to them. If the owner sold one of them, the couple had no recourse. If the owner sold the children, the parents had no recourse. The bonds of family that Athenians considered among the most fundamental of human ties simply did not attach to enslaved people in any way the law would recognise or protect. People formed those bonds anyway, because people do, because the need for connection is not something legislation can simply remove. But those bonds were always contingent on a third party's decision, maintained at the sufferance of someone whose primary concern was not their maintenance. There was a sanctuary at Athens, a temple precinct sacred to the craftsman god Hephaestus, where an enslaved person who was being severely mistreated could take refuge and request to be sold to a new owner. This is often cited as an example of the protections available to enslaved people in Athens. It is not nothing. It demonstrates that Athens was aware, at some level, that the system could produce abuses that even the system found excessive. But it is worth being precise about what this protection actually was. It was a mechanism for changing who owned you, not for ceasing to be owned. It was a safety valve, a pressure release designed to address the most extreme cases in a way that prevented them from becoming destabilizing, not a challenge to the fundamental logic of the institution. The slave who successfully accessed this sanctuary went from one owner to another. The institution continued. There was resistance. It would be strange if there were not, and the historical record suggests that Athens was aware of this and concerned by it in the way that any system dependent on coercion is concerned by the possibility of its own unravelling. Enslaved people ran away when they could, which was more difficult than it sounds in a society with extensive social surveillance, where a person without clear status was immediately suspect, and where most of the places one might run to had their own systems of slavery and their own reasons to return escaped slaves to their owners. They worked slowly, broke tools, performed tasks with precisely enough competence to avoid punishment, and precisely little enough to extract something back from the system, something in the margins between what was demanded and what was actually possible. They formed. If you like the video so far, please leave us a like and a sub. A sub to the channel helps us make more videos for you to watch and keep the channel alive. They formed relationships with each other, maintained cultural identities, kept alive, quietly and persistently, the interior lives that the law did not recognize. The Laurion mines were the site of at least one major episode of mass desertion, in the period of the Peloponnesian War, when the Spartan occupation of a fortified position in Attica made escape more feasible for the mine workers than it was in normal times. Tens of thousands of enslaved people fled towards Spartan lines over the course of that period, a mass departure that crippled the mine's output for years and demonstrated in the most direct possible terms how foundational their coerced labour was to the operation that was supposed to be sustaining it. Athens was forced to import enslaved workers to replace them, an expensive process, and the mines took time to recover. The enslaved population had exited the system at the first opportunity that made exit viable. This too is a form of political expression, of the kind that people without formal political standing are sometimes forced to find. The Athenians recovered from this. They rebuilt the workforce at Laurion. They rebuilt the household system. They rebuilt everything, because the economic and social architecture of the city depended on it being rebuilt. And they continued to build the temples and write the plays and conduct the trials and vote in the assembly and discuss the nature of justice in the agora, all of it sustained by labour that the system did not want them to look at too directly. We still do not look at it very directly. The standard story of ancient Athens spends much more time on the Parthenon and Socrates than it does on the mine workers and the household slaves and the tens of thousands of people whose unacknowledged labour made the classical moment possible. This is not simply an oversight produced by missing sources, though the sources are genuinely uneven. It is a choice, inherited from the ancient world's own selective attention, carried forward through centuries of Western education, that found in Athens a mirror for its own ideals, and was careful about what it placed in front of that mirror. The Parthenon appears in the textbooks. The Laurion mines appear less often. The decision about which parts of Athens to emphasize is itself a decision about what we want Athens to mean, and we have consistently wanted it to mean something that the people inside the mine did not share. The Parthenon is genuinely beautiful. The philosophy is genuinely significant. The democracy was genuinely a new kind of experiment in human organization, one that produced real ideas about civic participation and collective self-governance that mattered to the people who participated in it and still matters to the ways we think about politics today. None of these things is made false by the fact that they rested on a foundation of enslaved human beings, but they are made more complicated. And complicated is the honest word for it, not the word Athens would have chosen, not the word that appears most often in the admiring histories, but honest. The people who hauled the stone for the Parthenon and ground the grain for the symposia and descended into the Laurion mines and prepared the meals and raised the children and managed the households of the citizen class were real. They had bodies that got tired and minds that went somewhere when the work allowed them, and fears that lived in the particular way that fears do when your safety depends entirely on the mood of people who own you. They did not, for the most part, leave records. The legal speeches that survive mention them when property disputes require it. The plays use them as stock characters whose limited perspective is sometimes played for comedy. The philosophy considers their nature in the abstract. They themselves are mostly silent in the record, not because they had nothing to say, but because the system that used their labour had no interest in preserving their voices. What we can say is that they were there, that the city could not have been what it was without them. that the freedom Athens celebrated was not separable from the unfreedom it constructed and maintained, that these two things were not unfortunate neighbours but structural partners, each requiring the other, and that looking at Athens clearly, fully, without the selective editing that flatters the narrative we would prefer, means holding both things at once, the genuine achievement and the genuine cost, and refusing to let the first make the second invisible. This is, among other things, what history is for. The management of enslaved populations at scale required, from Athens' perspective, a set of institutional and social arrangements that went beyond simple coercion. Pure coercion is expensive. It requires constant oversight, constant enforcement, and produces a workforce that does the minimum required to avoid punishment and nothing more. Athens, like other ancient slave societies, had developed a more sophisticated set of arrangements that combined the threat of coercion with positive incentives, social structures, and even a degree of legal protection, all calibrated to extract more useful labour from the enslaved population than simple fear could produce. The peculium was one of these arrangements. Though the term is more formally Roman than Athenian, the practice of allowing enslaved people to accumulate small amounts of property that technically belonged to their owner, but that were in practice treated as the slave's own. This did not make enslaved people property owners in any legal sense. It created the functional appearance of ownership, which was enough to produce the motivational benefits of ownership without requiring the city to revise the legal category. A person who has something to lose, even something that is not legally theirs, behaves differently than a person who has nothing. Athens understood this in practice, even if it did not articulate it in quite those terms. The practice of allowing skilled enslaved people to work for hire, keeping a portion of their earnings, was another version of the same logic. The slave paid the owner a daily or weekly rate, negotiated with the kind of formality that acknowledged the owner's ultimate authority while creating a space of economic activity that functioned like freedom without technically being it. For the owner, this was more profitable than direct employment, because the owner collected a guaranteed income without managing the slave's work directly. For the enslaved person, it was an opportunity to accumulate resources and build commercial relationships that, in a very small number of cases, eventually enabled manumission. Manumission, the formal act of freeing an enslaved person, existed in Athens and was neither uncommon nor universal. The reasons owners freed enslaved people were varied: gratitude, practical arrangement, the terms of a will, the resolution of a business relationship, the desire to free a person with whom the owner had formed a close personal bond. All of these appear in the record. The frequency of manumission was high enough that Athenian law had developed formal procedures for it, and that the metic class contained a significant number of freed enslaved people who were building lives as free residents of a city where they could not vote or hold office, but where they could work, accumulate, and in some cases prosper. What this meant for the institution as a whole was that manumission served as a pressure release. The people who were most capable, most commercially valuable, most likely to be in a position to accumulate resources toward their own freedom were precisely the people who, in a purely coercive system, would be most likely to organize resistance. By providing them with a path, however difficult and unlikely for most, the system redirected their energies from resistance to compliance, from opposition to ambition within the available terms. This was not a conscious conspiracy. It was an institutional arrangement that had evolved to serve the interests of the people who benefited from it, which is how most institutional arrangements evolve. The children who grew up in enslaved households faced a particular situation that is worth pausing on. They were born into a legal status that had nothing to do with anything they had done or would do. They were property from birth, born to mothers who could not protect them from sale, could not give them legal standing, could not secure for them the kind of basic continuity of life that parents in free circumstances could provide. They were raised, in many cases, within a household that they would come to know intimately, where they might form attachments and learn skills and develop something like a sense of belonging, and then they might be sold away from all of it at any point, for any reason, and the people who had been closest to them had no recourse. Athens did not find this troubling in a systematic way. There were individual Athenians who might have experienced private unease about specific situations, whose memoirs and personal reflections we do not have because they were not recorded. The public discourse of the city, its philosophy, its law, its political practice, treated the situation of enslaved children as a normal feature of the world rather than as a moral problem requiring resolution. The economics of the institution were also visible in the public finances of Athens in ways that the city's historians sometimes preferred not to emphasize. The lease of public slaves, the taxation of slave transactions, the revenue from the Laurion mines operated by enslaved labour, these all flowed into the Athenian treasury in significant amounts. The building programme of the 5th century, the Parthenon, the Propylaea, the other structures on the Acropolis that remained even in their damaged form among the most admired architectural achievements in human history, was funded by a combination of tribute from Athens' empire and revenue from the Laurion silver that enslaved people extracted. The marble that makes the Parthenon beautiful was quarried at Pentelicon, and the people who quarried it included enslaved workers, operating under conditions not entirely different from those at Laurion. The buildings that Athens built to celebrate its gods and its civic identity were built, in the most direct material sense, by people who were not part of the civic identity being celebrated. Pericles, who oversaw the great building programme and whose name is most associated with the Athenian Golden Age, gave a famous speech, recorded and probably substantially rewritten by Thucydides, in which he celebrated Athens as the school of Greece, as a model of freedom and civic virtue and human achievement that the rest of the world should recognise and admire. He spoke of Athenian citizens as people who combined private responsibility with public participation, who engaged with the life of the city as free individuals rather than as subjects of a ruler. He said nothing about the enslaved people who maintained the households of those free individuals, who built the buildings of the city those free individuals inhabited, who extracted the silver that funded the military power those free individuals exercised. He was not being deliberately deceptive. He was describing Athens as Athens saw itself, from the perspective of the people for whom Athens' self-description was intended. The gap between that description and the fuller picture was not experienced as a gap by the people who held it. It was experienced as simply how things were, the background conditions of a world in which some people were free citizens and some people were not, and the freedom of the citizens was understood as the genuinely important fact about the situation. We inherit this selective vision along with everything else Athens bequeathed to the Western tradition. The concept of democracy, the practice of philosophy as a public activity, the idea that civic participation is a fundamental human good, the architecture, the drama, the historical writing, all of it came wrapped in a particular way of seeing that included some things very clearly and left others systematically out of focus. Recognizing what was left out of focus does not require abandoning everything that was clearly seen. It requires holding the full picture, which is more complicated than either the admiring version or the purely critical one. The people who held up the system that produced all of this were not abstractions. They were individuals, with specific locations in specific households and specific positions in specific minds. With skills they had developed, and knowledge they had accumulated and relationships they had formed and interior lives that the system did not record but that existed nonetheless. They are present in the history of Athens in the way that the ground is present in the history of the Parthenon, necessary, structural and visible only if you think to look. The Athenian assembly, which gathered on the Nix Hill, a natural bowl of stone overlooking the city, was one of the genuine innovations of the ancient world, and its workings were remarkable in ways that deserve acknowledgement even as we hold on to the fuller picture. Any citizen who chose to attend could speak. The decisions that emerged from the assembly had the force of law and bound the entire community. The jury courts, with their large panels of citizen jurors, provided a form of legal participation that was genuinely popular in scale, hundreds of people weighing in on cases that in other societies would be decided by a handful of specialists or by whoever held power. The offices of the city were filled by lottery among citizens, which meant that a craftsman or a farmer had the same formal chance of serving as the most educated and well-connected member of the elite. These were not small things. They represented a real experiment in the idea that ordinary people were capable of self-governance, that wisdom and judgment were not the exclusive property of hereditary elites or specially trained individuals, that a community could make decisions about its own affairs through a process of collective deliberation, rather than through the pronouncements of kings or priests. This idea was new. It was not self-evidently true to most of the ancient world. Its working out in Athens over more than a century was genuinely consequential, not just for Athens but for the subsequent history of political thought in the Western tradition. The philosophers who worked in Athens were responding to this political reality as much as they were shaping it. Socrates challenged his interlocutors to examine their assumptions precisely because those interlocutors were making decisions, as citizens, that affected everyone. Plato wrote about the ideal city partly as a response to the failures he saw in the actual city, the city that had executed his teacher, and whose democratic processes he sometimes regarded with the suspicion of someone who had seen them produce terrible outcomes. Aristotle, working later, and in a more systematic way, treated the question of political organisation as an empirical one, studying the constitutions of dozens of polis to understand what actually produced stable and good governance. All of this intellectual energy was real. Its consequences have been genuinely enormous. Political philosophy as a discipline, the idea that the organisation of societies is a subject for serious rational inquiry rather than for religious prescription or royal tradition, has roots in classical Athens that are direct and traceable. We are not done with the conversation that Athens started, not by any measure. But the conversation happened in a particular material setting, and the setting matters to the conversation. The citizens who gathered on the Nix, who attended the dramatic festivals, who argued in the agora and served on juries and held the offices distributed by lot, were people whose time was available for these activities because they were not spending it grinding grain or hauling water or carrying ore out of the ground. Their leisure, which is to say their capacity for civic participation, was produced by the labour of people who were excluded from the participation their labour made possible. This is not a coincidence or an accident. It is the operating logic of the system. Aristotle, in his discussion of why certain people are not fit for citizenship, explicitly includes those whose daily labour leaves them without the leisure for civic life. Banausic labour, he calls it, the work of craftsmen and manual labourers, and he considers it degrading to the people who perform it, not simply inconvenient, but actually deforming to the faculties required for civic participation. This argument was useful to Athens in a very specific way, because it simultaneously explained why enslaved people were not citizens, and provided a justification for keeping them in the condition that produced the argument's conclusion. If degrading labour degrades the capacity for civic participation, and if enslaved people perform degrading labour, then enslaved people lack civic capacity. That the degrading labour was performed under coercion, and that the coercion rather than the labour itself might be the relevant factor, was not a line of inquiry that the argument pursued. The Athenian economy was substantially dependent on slave labour in ways that were not incidental. When Athens fought its wars, it fought partly to secure new supplies of enslaved people, through the capture of defeated populations. The Athenian treasury benefited from the slave trade through taxes. Individual citizens benefited from their own enslaved labourers, or from renting enslaved workers to operations that needed labour. The wealth of Athens, at the individual and the collective level, was built through a network of economic relationships that had enslaved labour at multiple points of the chain. Removing that labour from the picture is not like removing an optional element. It is like removing a structural wall. The silver standard that Athenian coins represented, that made them trusted across the Mediterranean, was a function of the silver that came out of Laurion. The Laurion silver was a function of the labour of tens of thousands of enslaved workers over generations. The Athenian navy, which protected the trade routes that made the commercial wealth of Athens possible, was partly funded by Laurion silver. The treasury surpluses that Pericles used for the building programme were accumulated during a period when Laurion was at peak productivity. The beautiful buildings of the Acropolis and the expanded democracy of the 5th century, and the cultural flourishing that produced the drama and the philosophy and the art that we still study and celebrate, all of this exists in a relationship with the Laurion mines and the enslaved labour that ran them that is direct, traceable, and not incidental. We choose, in the conventional telling of this story, to hold the beautiful and the troubling parts in separate containers, to discuss the democracy and the philosophy in one context and the slavery in another, to treat them as parallel stories rather than as a single story in which they are structurally entangled. This separation is comfortable. It allows us to celebrate what deserves celebration without the discomfort of the fuller picture. But it is not accurate, and the inaccuracy is not neutral. It shapes what we think Athens was, and through Athens, what we think the ideals Athens supposedly represents are. If the democracy and the philosophy and the art were possible because of the slavery, then the slavery is not external to what Athens achieved. It is part of what Athens was. And so we find ourselves at the end of tonight's journey through a city that was both more remarkable and more troubling than the version most of us were given. We began in the pre-dawn dark of an Athenian household, in a body that woke not to rest but to work, that moved through a day of tasks invisible to the people it served, that slept on a mat near a hearth and prepared already, even in sleep, for the morning's demands. We moved from there to the remarkable and unsettling story of Pasion, a man who arrived in Athens as property and ended it as a citizen, whose story is both a testament to individual capability and a window into the precise mechanisms by which the system extracted everything it could from the people inside it, and found new forms of extraction when the old ones were exhausted. We descended into the Laurion mines, into the bad air and the lamp smoke and the stone walls pressing close, into the place where the silver came from that paid for everything above ground, and was commemorated on coins that still appear in museums described as symbols of Athenian civilization, without mention of who pulled the ore out of the dark. And we sat, finally, with the institution that underlies all of it, the democracy that was genuinely an innovation in human political life, and was sustained at every level by people who had no place in it at all. There is a thread running through all four of these stories, and it is not complicated to name. It is the thread of invisibility. The household slave who learned to be present without being seen, who developed the art of existing in a room without disturbing it, whose labour was the thing that made the room possible. Pasion, who was noticed only because he made himself too valuable to continue ignoring, and who even in being noticed was noticed primarily as a commercial asset rather than a person. The mine workers who descended into the hill and whose names the city did not record, and whose suffering the philosophy did not examine, whose existence was acknowledged only when they escaped in large enough numbers to create a productivity problem. The enslaved population whose labour the philosophy discussed in the abstract and the democracy depended on in the concrete, who are present in every account of classical Athens in the same way that the ground is present in every account of a building, necessary, structural, and rarely mentioned. They were all inside the same system, they all held it up, and the system had a remarkable capacity to look past them toward the beautiful things they were building, the gleaming city, the ideas about freedom and virtue and the examined life, without quite meeting their eyes. We do something similar when we inherit the story of Athens and choose which parts to carry forward with us. We are making a selection, just as the ancient sources made theirs. The honest version of that inheritance holds the achievement and the cost together, in the same hand without letting either dissolve the other. It is more uncomfortable than the version with only the marble and the philosophy. It is also more complete. History is not comfortable when you look at it this closely. It was not comfortable to live either, for most of the people who lived it. The man on the mat near the hearth, the woman carrying water before the city woke, the worker whose name does not appear in any record that survived the centuries, they endured something. They endured it not because they were less human than the citizens arguing about justice above them, but because the system they lived inside had a very specific and very consistent answer to the question of whose comfort mattered and whose labour would be used to provide it. They were inside that answer every day, feeling its weight, navigating its requirements, finding within it whatever small spaces were available for the things that make a life feel like more than its obligations. You're lying down now, probably, or nearly there. Your day had its own demands, its own small exhaustions, its own moments where the weight of what was required of you settled into your shoulders and stayed there. You understand something about that, even across the distance of 25 centuries, even across the distance of every circumstance that separates your life from the lives in tonight's story. The body tires, the mind seeks rest, the morning comes regardless. Let the city of Athens recede now, slowly, the way ancient things recede into something more distant, more golden, more shaped by time into a soft and recognizable outline. Let the mind go dark around you, but gently, the way underground places go dark when there is no longer anything required of the dark. Let Passion's ledgers close, and the household hearth cool, and the noise of the agora settle into a murmur that is more like water than argument, more like the sound a busy world makes when it is very far away and you are very still. You have been somewhere real tonight. You have been among people who were real, whose days were real, whose labour made possible something that history decided was worth remembering. and whose names history mostly did not bother to keep. Remember them anyway, in the small way that a mind settling towards sleep remembers things, not with precision, but with a warmth of recognition. They were there, they held it up. The city stood, as cities do, because of what was beneath it. Rest now, the work is done for tonight. The seasons in Athens are distinct enough to shape the work in ways that the master's family experiences as climate, and you experience as logistics. Summer means the kitchen is unbearable by midday, the fire that is necessary for cooking adding its heat to the heat of the day in a room that has no real ventilation to speak of, the air thick and still, and carrying every smell in concentrated form. You work in it because the family eats regardless of the season, and the work does not pause because the environment has become difficult. You have developed a kind of physical discipline around heat, a way of moving more slowly in it, of conserving energy, of finding the small patches of relative coolness near the floor and using them strategically. This is not comfort, it is management. Winter means the pre-dawn walk to the fountain in cold that Athens does not consider dramatic, but that your body registers as significant, especially the hands, which have their own relationship to cold temperature, responding to it in ways that are more pronounced now than when you were younger, and that the kitchen fire restores only slowly. If you like the video so far, please leave us a like and a sub. A sub to the channel helps us make more videos for you to watch and keep the channel alive. The city in winter has a different quality. The streets quieter in the early hours, the activity of the agora compressed toward the warmer parts of the day, the household itself somewhat more enclosed, somewhat less connected to the city's public life. You note these changes the way you note most things, as information about the environment that has implications for the work. Spring and autumn are the manageable seasons, the ones where the work is simply what it is without the additional difficulty of temperature at its extremes. The produce available in the agora changes with the seasons, and this shapes what you cook, which shapes what the household eats, which is a form of influence on the household's daily experience that passes entirely without acknowledgement, because it is built into the structure of the world rather than into any particular decision you make. The household eats what the season provides, and what the season provides is curated and prepared by you, and the family has no particular reason to think about this chain of causation, because the food simply appears, as all the household's functions simply appear, without visible mechanism. The world into which Pasion entered as a free man, and then as a citizen, was one undergoing its own considerable turbulence. The period of his life coincided with the tail end of the Peloponnesian War, and its aftermath, the brief and violent period of the 30 tyrants, the restoration of the democracy, and the subsequent decades when Athens was rebuilding both its political stability and its commercial standing after the destruction of its naval power and the loss of its empire. In this environment, a financial institution with strong relationships across the Greek world, capable of providing credit and managing currency for the merchants and states who needed those services, was particularly valuable. Pasion's bank provided something that Athens needed during this period, which was commercial continuity in an environment where political continuity was not guaranteed. The banking operation did not stop when the democracy was overthrown, and did not restart when it was restored, because commercial relationships do not respect political transitions in the way that official institutions do. Merchants still needed to exchange currency, loans still needed to be made and recovered, deposits still needed to be kept. The bank continued through the political turbulence in ways that were useful to whoever held power at any given moment, and that usefulness was its own protection. This is one reason why Pasion's accumulation of wealth during a period of Athenian difficulty was possible. He was providing something necessary enough that the changing political authorities had reason to leave him alone. He was also discreet, which the sources suggest was a characteristic of his professional conduct throughout his career. Banking in the ancient world was built on discretion. Clients needed to know that their financial affairs would not become public knowledge. The bank's reliability depended on keeping information about depositors and borrowers private, and the banker who could not keep that information private would find his client list diminishing rapidly. Pasion was known for keeping confidences. This made him useful to people who had confidences to keep, which in a politically turbulent period included a very wide range of people. The theatrical life of Athens intersects with your world in a way that is almost entirely indirect. The Dionysia festival, when the great tragedies and comedies are performed in the theatre on the south slope of the Acropolis, is an event that the household discusses, that the master attends, that shapes the social conversation for days afterward. You hear about the plays through this conversation, the plots described and debated, the performances evaluated, the ideas raised and argued over in the evenings. The plays often concern themselves with enormous themes: the nature of justice, the relationship between human will and divine fate, the experience of suffering and loss, the question of what a person owes to their family and what they owe to the state. You hear these descriptions and you register the themes in the way that you register everything, attentively and without full access to the context that would let you evaluate them completely. The plays are about free people, almost entirely. When enslaved characters appear in the comedies, they're usually comic figures, sometimes clever in the way that subversive figures are clever in comedy, sometimes merely convenient. The tragedies deal with the suffering of kings and heroes and the families of the powerful, because tragic suffering in the Greek framework requires a height from which to fall, and people like you do not have the height. Your suffering, which is real and constant and present in every day of your life, is not the material of tragedy. It is the background against which the tragedy occurs. You have thought about this sometimes, in the way you think about things that are not useful to think about, but that your mind returns to anyway. The great works that Athens produces, the philosophy and the poetry and the drama that the city considers its finest achievement, that visitors come from across the Greek world to see and hear and think about. These works were made possible in part by the economic arrangements that structure your day. The dramatist who spent the morning thinking about the next scene and the afternoon refining a chorus has a household that someone manages. The philosopher who spent the day in the agora questioning assumptions about justice goes home to an evening meal that someone prepared. The connection between the cultural achievement and the domestic labour that supports it is not acknowledged in the achievement. The achievement speaks about human dignity and justice, and the nature of the good life, as though these concepts exist in a space separate from the conditions that make their consideration possible. You do not resent the plays or the philosophy exactly. They are what they are, the products of people operating within a system that grants them the freedom to produce them. What you notice, more than resentment, is the distance between what the system claims to value and what the system actually values, between the words spoken about justice in the assembly and the theatre and the agora, and the conditions of life in the kitchen before dawn. This distance is the most reliable thing about the world you inhabit. It is there every day, consistent, clear to you in ways that it is not clear to the people it protects. The olive trees in the gardens that some households maintain at the edge of the city need tending in ways that come around with the seasons, the pruning, the careful attention to the health of trees that have sometimes been growing for longer than any living person can remember, that will continue growing after everyone currently involved with them is gone. There is something in this continuity that feels significant on the days when you work among them, something about participating in a cycle that does not begin or end with you, that simply passes through you on its way from the past to the future. The trees do not know what your situation is, they require the work regardless, and you do the work. Where in the world are you watching from? Let me know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe if you want to see more videos like this. See you on the next one.